Riverside.
Okay. Okay, there it goes. All right, going live now. All right, hey, there we are. We are up and running.
I
Excellent.
don't believe you.
Prove it. Oh, I'm seeing an
Okay.
ad on YouTube now, so something must be working.
Something
Yep,
must.
looks like we're
Okay.
good.
Unfortunately, it's also
Okay.
blaring in my ears, so bear with me a second.
Yep, it's doing things.
There we go,
Okay,
muted.
good.
All right. Okay, so that was an adventure. Now, sorry about that. All kinds of rookie mistakes happening here. All right, so welcome everyone to Reviewer Roundtable, episode 4. We are the reviewers of the Roundtable, right? We have with us today Amos from Currawong, Cameron from GoldenSound, and Lachlan from Passionforsound, and I am WaveTheory, aka Brian, right? And yeah, this is our second live stream, I believe, right, gentlemen? I think we did
Yes.
No, hang
two.
on.
Second live one, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
live one,
I think
sorry,
we
yes,
did
yes.
two, like podcast format, and then now we're on the second one live. So our main topic of the day is going to be things that have surprised us on our audio journeys, and I think we have 4 very varied and long journeys here. So hopefully we can have some rich conversation there. But first, we kind of do a little appetizer topic before we jump into the main topic. And this time that is going to be either a product category or like some new technology development or something like that within audio that we are watching with keen interest, watching its development and following that. Who wants to go first on that one?
And there's dead
I'll
silence.
I'll jump in.
We're not watching anything. We're not tech people at all.
The delay
Yeah.
makes it a little tricky.
It does. Yeah. So the one I've been waiting for this for quite a while because this is pre-COVID. I was at the last Melbourne Hi-Fi show, the Stranded Hi-Fi show before COVID, and there were some guys there called Wing Acoustics that were showing off their speakers, and they used a very special new transducer design. It's never been done before, as far as I know. It's basically it's a piece of some sort of material that's on some kind of a hinging core at the bottom, and so the signal causes this thing to flap with the frequencies at obviously very, very, very high speed. And the sound it produced from a speaker was nothing short of exceptional. It had this naturalness to the leading edges of notes, and the overall sort of just sound character was fantastic. And at the time, I was chatting to them about headphones because obviously my channel's almost entirely headphones, and they actually had some prototype headphones they were working on, which were essentially, I think they'd even pulled apart. They were either HD800s or HD600s, something similar like that, and they literally just ripped the guts out and gaffer taped their drivers in it almost. And these things sounded just phenomenal for something that hadn't been properly put together yet. So obviously they weren't ready to sell, A, because they were gaffer taped together, but B, they didn't sound perfect yet, but you could hear where they were headed. And so that's the one that for me, I email them every now and again and say, where's it up to, what's happening? And I can't wait for the day they actually release a headphone. I believe at last report it's still a couple of years away because they're emphasising their speaker development first. But yeah, that's the one I'm very, very eagerly anticipating because it's literally a brand new brand new technology that we've never seen or heard in a headphone before, and that's exciting to me.
Yeah, new driver tech does sound exciting. Yep. All right, how about you, Cameron? What you got?
Mine's a new driver tech as well. You guys may have seen it already. It's the XMEMS drivers. They had them at... I first saw them at CanJam London last year. They had some working stuff again at CanJam New York. And iFi has just released a version of the Diablo, which is able to power them. It's a effectively silicon-based, like solid-state driver tech. And it's got a lot of advantages in terms of... how linear it can be in particular and what you can do with it with DSP. It's going to be kind of revolutionary for particularly things like wireless headphones, I think. It's going to be quite substantial there. The challenging thing is that where most drivers, when they move sort of back and forth, the actual signal that's feeding them might go from, say, +2 to -2 volts, and it oscillates around the 0 mark, whereas with these, they need a bias voltage, so it can never go below 0. It has to go from 0 to 4 or whatever. So you can't just run them off the same kind of amps and things that normal drivers can. But they sound incredible. It's like E-stat speed and detail in an IEM package. It's really cool, and it's really early in its infancy at the moment. I've only heard the sort of prototypes. They had like a 3D printed thing there, which the fact that that sounded so good is kind of incredible by itself. But there is a product which is coming out now, and there is going to be more stuff coming down the line. But the XMEMS drivers is something that I'm watching with keen interest. I don't think it's going to sort of be the kind of thing which we'll see that much maybe in full-size headphones or speakers maybe, even though it can be used there. I think it's more going to be for true wireless things in total. But yeah, that's that I'm quite looking forward to seeing where that goes. I think we've lost Lachlan.
Well, yeah, he's got to fix a mic issue. By the way, if in the comments, if I'm too loud or quiet, let me know too. Seems like most of the mic issues were about Lachlan. Anyway, Cameron, you mentioned that you thought that this driver tech you were just talking about was going to be revolutionary for wireless headphones or mobile.
Yes.
Did I hear you correct? Like, with the bias voltage that's required, how do you see that working?
Because the actual sort of making the circuitry to drive them isn't difficult. In fact, you could, in theory, make an amplifier. I was speaking to one of the guys sort of who's involved with it, and the of an existing amplifier applies a bias voltage to it. Challenge is just you can't mix and match, basically. So where a lot of IEMs have 2 BAs and 1 dynamic driver or EST driver, they've got lots of different driver types. You can't do that with these without having some quite complicated source circuitry. But in terms of just a true wireless earbud and stuff, making the actual signal path to provide that signal with the bias and everything's pretty simple. So it's pretty easy to do that.
Okay. All right, Amos.
Probably I'm going to tell you a completely different thing. I'm waiting for Rob Watts to come out with a Davina ADC and his ability to record music. Because I've been listening to some, straight to DSD recordings lately. And DSD is a format which is kind of, it has its, good and bad points. I mean, it tries to be, pure and minimalist and that, and minimally processed. But the problem with DSD recording, of course, is that you can only very slightly EQ it using a variation of HQ player, essentially. And, Rob Watts obviously manages to do something inside his gear. But I just, new recording technology that can actually better capture what comes into the microphone is what I'm keenly interested in, because, that's, as far as the technology of transducers and other things are pushed, it doesn't make any difference if your music is still limited on the recording end. So that's
a really good point.
Yeah,
I was actually just thinking about that thinking about that this morning, and the fact that there was some conversation recently, and I'm not trying to take us down the rabbit hole of, what the artist intended, like we spoke about last time, or anything like that. But there's been some discussion on my channel about, from a recent Interconnect review, talking about the fact that all these studios use, Canare or similar type cables, and why are we going to spend money on expensive interconnects, blah, blah, blah. And I was listening to a couple of tracks the other day, and the vast gulf in the recording quality between them, I was thinking there's no way they're using the same gear in both of these studios, or the mixing engineers have made some vastly different decisions. But it did get me thinking about the fact that we're so limited by what comes through in the recording. Like you're saying, Amos, it's a really interesting thing. If we can get gains in that area, it'd be fantastic.
Yeah, that's going to be pretty neat. I'm sort of hoping that his ADC, I'm sure it is probably going to turn out to be quite good, just from what he's mentioned to me. I've spoken to him a little bit about it. I just hope that it kind of catches on, if that makes sense, because part of the issue with a lot of professional environments is that there's a lot of, I guess you could say, absolute objectivity in a lot of circumstances. There's a lot of people who will, build their studios and things around what they think sounds the best and kind of not go that route. But there is also a lot of situations where they'll take an ADC or DAC because it has minus 115 dB THD plus N, and that's what matters, and so they don't look anything beyond that. So my concern is that even if it is absolutely fantastic, it won't catch on just because some people in that industry might not see the benefit of it. But it's going to be quite interesting to hear recordings made using a pulse array ADC with a pulse array DAC. That's going to be quite cool.
Yeah, true.
I mean, there's a lot of inertia in most professional communities. And so like when you get something new like this, there is definitely a lag, and it takes time for it to catch on, all that. And it's probably just going to be one of those things that if it's as good as we all hope it is, then it's just going to take time for people to hear the difference and go, oh yeah, we really should be using that.
Yeah, it takes there'll be a couple of early adopters, obviously, and it would just actually,
Yeah.
it's a completely diversion topic. So, but I was reading an article by a psychologist who was talking about, as a different topic, but similar kind of thing, about we've just had the official, in Japan, people are finally allowed, well, not allowed, I mean, the recommendations are don't have to wear masks in public places, and so everyone's taken down their masks, please wear a mask sign and all that kind of stuff. But everyone's still wearing masks, and then a few people are not, and then apparently there's just a slight, a few maverick people start, and then a few more, and then suddenly everyone will take off their masks. So there'll be, I think, a progression of, a few people the Divina will come out, a few people will try it, we'll start getting recordings out from it, and then there'll be a slow momentum build up, and then I think it'll start to shift things. Although I think that tiny, there'll be tiny recording studios. I think the smaller recording studios, who like native DSD and Sound Liaison and that, are probably more interested in adopting early technologies like that, or more radical technologies at first. Whereas bigger studios will be like, well, if you're just recording pop music, which is going to be processed anyway, why would they change their whole system for something like
that's
that?
it.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, I think the number of those big studios that everything's kind of built in a way, it's all been custom made from the beginning, it's all in its place, and then all of a sudden you've got, unless they make it a really clean rack mount, which maybe they will, but I wonder how many of them it's just going to be the physical and financial restrictions on them choosing to adopt it. But then I think there's also going to be, like you said, Amos, those studios that are focused on the best possible sound, but they're going to be the minority because it's not what most of the music is. Most of the music is pop and the like. So it'll be interesting to see.
All right. Well, my product category of interest right now, and I think it also is a nice segue into our main topic, is streamers. Like, I have recently moved into primarily using streamers as source gear and all of that, and so particularly at the lower end of the cost, like I will be watching to see how streamers keep inching down in price. Like I think, is it NAD? I just got like an advertisement.
Yeah, I saw that
from
one.
NAD that has like a $350 streamer out now, and so those kinds of things, like I mean, again, to transition to the topic of what has surprised us, I have been surprised by how much of a difference removing a computer from the signal chain can actually make. And so, dovetailing with that is, like, can streamers continue to get better and cheaper and become a more and more viable source gear for more and more people at the lower end of the cost scale? So that's something that I'm watching too.
I'm definitely with you on that, because I've just been shooting the videos for the Neo stream.
Yeah, I have one of those in too, actually. Yeah.
It's complex but interesting. But I already had done the Zen stream. But I was just using a couple of Raspberry Pis with Volumio or Diet Pi or something like that for the Rune endpoints in my system, because it separates out my computer, which has a bazillion things hooked up to it, and is obviously probably a nice generator of high frequency noise, from separating that out from my system. So and start getting all the wall warts and everything off onto for all computer stuff plugged in somewhere separately entirely, so that that noise from all of that. And I think the interesting thing was how much difference, once you start focusing on just eliminating potential sources of noise from your system, how much it improved things more, and even to a degree which, as with the Neo stream, is its own discussion, because it has that optical isolation on the networking. It's like, this should not make any difference, and then it's like, wait a sec, that doesn't make sense. So those are the surprises, what I call the audio rabbit hole, where you yeah.
I started playing, one of my patrons lent me, and then I ended up buying it from him, the Uptone Ether Regen. So it's a network switch with a dedicated audio one that's I don't know. I haven't looked into it yet because I'm not ready to do the review. But it's got an isolated output on it. I don't think it's using fiber. I think it's just using some filtering of some sort. And I went into it thinking I happen to need a switch. I'm curious to see if it's going to work better. I'll go with it. And yeah, I'm the same. I'm in that space where I'm going, I can't explain how this can possibly work because there's all those miles and miles and miles of cable that run from wherever to wherever before it gets to my office. And there's this one little box and this short length of cable that shouldn't make a difference to what I'm hearing. But I'm in the same boat where I've played with it. And I'm going, that's actually somehow making the sound better, and I don't get it.
Well,
I mean, with
if I
the-
just oh yeah, go on. Rick.
I was gonna say with the like the ether regen, it's less to do with the sort of distance of cables and stuff. Like I'm staying a little bit agnostic on sort of whether or not that makes a difference. I have actually tried one, but just for full transparency, I'm actually doing some beta testing stuff with a company that's doing something in this area, so I don't want to like make too many comments there. But it's more just about the fact that primarily your router is an enormous source of noise. In theory, at frequencies and stuff, which shouldn't make a difference, but still a huge amount of noise. And so the ether regen, it's got an optical or a laser diode, I think it is, coupler inside. So there's basically no direct electrical connection between your router side and the other side. So it's not so much about the length of cable or anything, but more just not letting the noise from that side of things actually come through to the other side.
Makes sense because
Well,
that's
that
what it sounds like.
explains,
It sounds like less noise. Sorry, Amos, you go.
Oh yeah. Oh no, the IFA released an inline Ethernet isolator as well. I was just going on to check some of their specifications for the Neo Stream, and then it's like, whoa, they have this new plug-in inline isolator. So I wonder if that's got optical isolation inside or what that's got. I don't think it's externally powered. I think it's
No, that one
optical
seems to
isolation.
just be a passive filter. I'm a little bit skeptical of that one, just because from a physics standpoint, there is a limit to how effective you can have a filter when it is actually that small. So I'm a little bit skeptical about that one, but yeah, it's interesting.
But I was surprised with the Neo Stream. It's like because I had the Gustar, I just did that, and that has streaming built in, which I think is a very good idea because it sounds the streamer itself sounds better. I felt than USB input, and it's nice that you can stream to it. So although of course you can't, storage is another issue. But yeah, so I thought, okay, let's try this OptiBox thing. You can actually live plug the connection because it's the networking is buffering, so you can actually just unplug, got about 2 seconds, and you can plug the new thing back in. And I could actually live hear the difference between the OptiBox being plugged in and not plugged in. It's like this. Hold on, Ethernet uses transformers and is balanced. This should not do anything. It's like, wait, hold on, it sounds better with the OptiBox plugged in. I don't know, but it didn't make any difference with the almost zero difference with the cord gear, which. So so there was maybe a tiny bit really. I mean, this is down to the threshold where I would not consider myself reliable, but I could maybe I'm hearing a tiny bit better. But it was interesting that someone was just asking me, should I buy? Is it worth buying? For spending $5,000 on a streamer, or should you just go with something simple, or what's the best deal? And it's like, well, it actually seems to depend really much on the gear you have. It's not just a simple yes it will or no it won't. It depends on the gear you have, and with a lot of gear seeming to, you get better. USB in a lot of DACs that I've experienced recently has been better. I think, Cameron, I remember you measured the USB in, was it the M scaler, I think, was better than the coax input or something like that. I recall reading something
yeah,
on
I
your
mean,
site.
that's quite common on DDCs just because there's challenges associated with basically reclocking a signal which is synchronous, i.e. the signal just keeps coming in, you can't tell it, wait, I need to do stuff or whatever, whereas with USB it's two-way. So the device itself actually tells the PC, all right, I'm ready, give me more stuff. I think, as Nick said earlier, though, in terms of the sort of affordability of stuff, the nice thing is that regardless of what anyone might think about audibility, this stuff is getting cheaper, which is really good. I mean, you can get SFP optical isolators for network from like TP-Link or something for 100 quid, I think now.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
it used to be that like the lowest jitter digital source that I tested was the Rockner WaveDream Net, which was, I think it's like $8,000 or something. It's like crazy expensive. And there was some other stuff which was a couple $1,000 DDC, still not cheap, which got close to it but not quite. But now there's the Hollow Red, which is same as it, and that's 700. And you've got stuff like the iFi ZenStream even, which is a few hundred, and it's not got all the outputs that the other ones do, but it's got really good performance as well. So I think, yeah, this stuff is getting cheaper, and whilst it's a bit of a hot topic in terms of whether it makes a difference or not, it's also something which now you can actually do without breaking the bank. So it's not necessarily as much of a worry.
We can get a Raspberry Pi with a fancy, audio hat or SPDIF hat. Yeah, I've got
Raspberry
one
Pis
sitting
are
on the
great.
desk. I forgot what they're called. They're sitting on the other day. Not Wavelink. I can't remember. I can't read it from here. Yeah, the optical isolator box, the optical format. They're just for changing format, and a set of them. I just bought a set because I'm actually going to wire up my house with them, just so I can get better Wi-Fi downstairs. And I thought, well, this is a good chance to actually get a set and just test if it made any difference. It made maybe a little bit of a difference with the Gustar, but I was using a ridiculously long cable as well because it's like 50 meters. And I should have tried with a short one actually, but it was interesting to play around with. But they also take just 5 volt, a standard 5 volt input, so you can actually, if you want to go down the real rabbit hole, you can actually just get an IFI fancy power supply and use that with them as well. Though I don't know how much noise they generate, those things. Who knows?
The iPower is really good. They're really clean.
I'm thinking like the actual optic converter box itself is that generating any noise. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's the other interesting thing is that whilst obviously on the surface it sounds like, okay, well, I'm blocking all the noise that's coming from upstream. That's great, so it must be better, right? But actually, there's also the question of, well, how much noise is this thing generating? Because even if you block everything that's coming from there, if the device that is then retransmitting stuff is worse, then you spend a lot of money to actually not fix anything. So
that is the potential weak link with their OptiBox, is that I think, as Amos mentioned, it's just like a 5 volt, 1 amp power supply that you could use a phone power brick to power if you wanted, right? And so, how clean is that? What power brick you're using.
But that's still on the network on the dirty side. On the optical side, you're still isolated from the near stream, so it shouldn't matter.
Yeah, the powers. So the way that these sort of galvanic isolated devices, there's some for USB, like Intona makes really good ones as well. The way that they effectively get power to the other side and then do that side is really clean, even if you use a terrible power supply. So it's typically not actually really an issue.
Okay, that's good.
But interesting. I think since we're down the rabbit hole, the thing that surprised me. This is one of the topics.
Set up the spice.
Let's just cause more drama. So everyone.
So those
hates
quantum resonators.
Yeah, I won't go that far. I could tell some stories about weird. It'd be fun to tell stories about weird things that friends had when I was in the US, but when I was visiting people in the US. But that's going way down there. The one in my own system was, people talked for years about the quality of USB cables and using fancy USB cables. And I found that because I tried to eliminate as much noise, without being able to physically test anything or with proper measuring gear, eliminate as much noise as possible, that, different USB cables seem to make no difference after that. And so I do wonder, and Rob Watts was saying online, he said in one of his posts that you're just changing the noise, with changing USB cables is just changing the noise profile of the transmission. So it's just shifting noise around. But I just find that, even just regular shielded USB cables are now fine in my system regardless. And
I think... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's
delay makes things tricky.
No. Please go ahead, Cameron.
Okay, I was just going to say that I think, as again Nick alluded to, the biggest thing that you can do really in this isn't changing cables or power supplies or anything like that, is getting rid of the PC. Especially if you have like a beefy gaming PC or something, that is just about the noisiest, worst possible device you could have in an audio chain. In just about every way, it's terrible. And there are some, really egregious examples where like you can just hear GPU activity coming through to your headphones and stuff. But yeah, even just like using a Raspberry Pi with the stock power supply, paying 50 quid or whatever it is, that can be a big improvement for a lot of chains over both objectively and subjectively, over just plugging things into the PC. DACs are seeming to get better with it. Like the filtering and isolation stuff they have is that DACs manufacturers are seeming to pay more attention to that, and some have got it kind of nailed where they literally just won't change no matter what you throw on it. But there's also quite a lot of stuff where they are quite sensitive to what's going on the digital side of things in terms of how noisy it is.
Yeah, part of my surprise with the streamers was because I was aware that computers are noisy sources and all of that, but I had been using a DDC, all along. It was a Singer SU2, which I realize is kind of like an entry level DDC, but it's decent. And the jump up from there to like the Zen stream, or I had the Neo stream in for review as well, and I just picked up a 2Go to match my Hugo 2 and all of that. Like, it's the difference moving from the DDC, which is already supposedly doing a lot of filtering and like all of that kind of stuff, to one of those was noticeable. And so I was a little bit surprised at that even with that DDC in there, how big of an improvement that was moving to streamers.
Yeah, I've had an interesting experience with the DDC side of things as well. So I use the SU6 from Singer, or Singsa. I'm not sure. I've never known what the correct pronunciation of that one is. But I've used the SU6, and I've actually found, for me, and I haven't gone deep down the streaming rabbit hole, because, as in using streamers, I use streaming services all the time, but because my work is so directly tied to my computer, and that's where I spend all my time, I just keep everything running through there, because I have to be able to jump from listening to music into a video call, like a meeting with a client or whatever, and then back over to the music. So the little bits and pieces that I've done using some pretty basic streaming setups. So I've had, Raspberry Pis in the system. I had a Pi to AES at one stage. What else have I tried? I've got obviously the LAN on the the Gustad R26 as well. I haven't found a significant shift when I'm using the DDC. If I'm using just a straight USB output from the computer, absolutely. But whether I go through, I've got a JCAT USB card in my PC, and whether I use that or the DDC, I don't find a huge difference with streamers. And maybe it's because I haven't gone into sort of the higher end streamers that do a bit more treatment of the signal. But I'm curious to know if anyone else has had a play with DDCs in a system and a kind of what I call an optimized PC system compared to a streamer. Any thoughts?
The JCAT USB card should kind of level the playing field quite a bit, because in terms of getting a clean USB out from your PC, that's kind of the best way to do it. Like there was a motherboard from, I think it was MSI or something, which I had a look at, and it's got a DAC up. I think they called it DAC up, a DAC specific USB port which advertised lower noise, and actually it was like 20% lower noise or something, so it was still just terrible, but just 20% less terrible. Whereas I imagine the JCAT card is probably going to be quite a lot cleaner. So
it was a big jump up from the stock sockets, that's for sure.
Yeah, and then the Syncser SU6 as well. That's got full galvanic isolation internally. The way that the power supply works in that's really clever as well. It's a super capacitor thing. So it's, I imagine that's more a case of just having a fairly optimized PC setup. I mean, the way that I've got my stuff set up is nothing's actually connected to my PC. I've got all of my PC stuff on like a Furman regulator, and just that's all on one thing. And then all of my audio stuff's on a PS Audio power plant at the moment, and it's all streaming in network and everything. So there's nothing touching it effectively. There's quite a difference on certain chains when I just suddenly go, okay, I'm going to connect that directly to the PC now. It does make a bit of a difference. But then, like comparing a Raspberry Pi to a cleaner streamer or something, there might be some if your DAC's really, really sensitive to it or something, or if the power supply you were using was terrible, but there's not much difference. Like, getting rid of the PC is the big thing. Or if you do need to use a PC, use a JCAT card, something like that. But once you've gotten rid of that kind of 99% of the noise, there's minor benefits to be had. And also, there's a lot, as said, a lot of DACs nowadays are getting much, much better at just being resistant to noise or issues on the source side of things. So.
Actually, on that note, you just reminded me something that you said, Cameron, and something that you said, Amos. When you're saying about the USB cables not making a difference once you get rid of the noise, Amos, one of the things I found with the SU6, the cable I ran between the computer and the SU6 made no difference at all. Whereas the cable I run from, if I'm going, say, from the JCAT card direct into a DAC, I found the USB cable still made a difference. But to go into the SU6, I could try any cable at all, couldn't hear a difference between them. So it was interesting, that whole noise factor and that shuffling around the noise idea definitely seems to be true from that. I think
one of our mutual supporters has the SU6 as well, and he said the same thing. We just made no difference whatsoever.
Yeah.
Which
The
probably
cable that
good
comes
proof that the
after
thing's
it,
working.
I'd argue. Yeah, that's right, exactly. Yeah, I'd argue that the cable that comes after the SU6 still matters, but maybe to a lesser degree. I haven't played around with that in depth, and I trying to avoid that one so we don't get too many pitchforks coming after
Oh
us
yeah,
today.
I squared S. We can go down the I squared S rabbit hole, but I just use whatever cables. Someone sent me a fancy Chinese looking cable. I just use that, and that seems to be fine. But I use HDMI. I used it. Oh, apparently I actually had one of the Belkin made Apple HDMI cables or something like that, which I just used randomly because it happened to be in my drawer. And then someone later said, "Oh no, actually this is one of the best cables." But probably because Apple tends to make their stuff fairly solidly. But it was like a 1 meter. I think it's 1 meter. Yeah, this thin but very stiff Apple cable I bought years ago in the Apple store when I was my first. Bought the first Apple TV. That was what it was for, or maybe it came with it. I can't remember, but yeah, that actually for I squared S, just a regular good quality HDMI cable worked fine. So that's another one of those other rabbit holes. But I mean, there's technical stuff behind I squared S and separating out all the channels and the clocking.
It's so hard to
I
know
have
because it
been
depends
able
on who you
to.
talk to.
I was gonna say so I'm gonna be making a video on this at some point. It's one I'm trying to structure very carefully because again, pitchforks will come out very easily. You can show differences in jitter caused by different cables. It's quite easy to do. They're not big, like the digital source makes a way bigger difference, but it is absolutely there. It's completely repeatable and also kind of predictable. Like the best cables aren't the ones that are pure silver and really expensive and all that kind of stuff. The best cables are almost always the ones where either they are perfectly to spec, or if the devices that you're using are slightly out of spec, then the ones which happen to be slightly closer to that, basically. Matching the characteristic impedance is the really important thing. And there are some like really high-end cables which do that really nicely, like the Wave Fidelity cables, the ones with all the like ferrite chokes and stuff on them. Those ones are like perfect, basically. So you get great performance out of them. The ferrites and stuff will attenuate noise. I don't know what to feel on the price of them, but they're good cables. But then you can get some very expensive cables as well, which just make things worse quite demonstrably. I mean, whether people like the effect of them is fine, but there's quite a lot of them where they're audiophile kind of tuned by ear, and as a result, they've kind of just gotten something which actually, in some cases, literally won't work with stuff. That's happened a couple times.
I've had one of the local distributors in Japan was clearing. I was at the show, and they were clearing out all these really expensive SPDIF cables and AES cables, and so for like stuff that was costing $900 for like $50 a pop. So I thought I'll just get a couple of them. Why not? And then I tried them in my system, and everything sounded kind of bright and harsh whenever I used them. So eventually I just got sick of using them, and then I decided, okay, I want to pull one of these apart and find what's in it. And it was but all their cables were using the same. It wasn't coaxial. It wasn't obviously a proper cable for SPDIF. I've got it, still sitting in a basket over there. It was using the same as their AES cable, this big chunky, heavily stranded silver plate. I don't know, silver plated copper or something like that. And it was like, no, this is not a proper SPDIF cable. And it turned out that now they're making proper SPDIF cables. But it's like, why would you make an SPDIF cable out of like just regular wire? The characteristic impedance mismatch will cause signal reflections and degrade the sound. That was obviously happening in my system, and the plugs weren't to spec anyway because they were loose, which was kind of irritating. But yeah, I was just really kind of I shouldn't have been shocked, but yeah, I was thinking that was one of the big issues with SPDIF cables. They're often out of spec, and USB stuff. I think a company on Headfi braided some USB cables and put them out, and they were just lambasted immediately and had to take them off. Stop advertising them because they were just lambasted for thinking they could braid a cable and it would work. But it's
And I think that's where some of the problems come from with the world of cables, is that there are those out there that are making cables, making big claims, and maybe not actually understanding how the cables are meant to work, what actually does work, etc. And I think it gives some of those good manufacturers that are taking the time to get the right specs, match the right materials, etc. It gives them a bad name and makes them all look like the good old snake oil, when really it's that there are some people out there that don't know what they're doing, and they're still marketing as if they do because they know how to connect X to cable Y, and they're saying it's that cable as a result, but it's actually not internally.
Yeah, I mean, this was on the subject of surprises. Like the first time I heard a cable difference was with headphone cables, and it just like it made me mad, and like, and the reason is it's like being more of a being a scientist and having a science background. I was initially in very much the cable skeptic camp, thinking, well, the changes here are going to be so small that it's not going to matter. And then I swapped out a stock cable on a pretty nice headphone with a cable that was bundled with that same headphone that the seller I bought it used. The seller bundled a nice cable with it, and I plugged that in and I put that on, thinking, okay, this was probably didn't need to be included, but whatever. Put it on, hit play, and then I was just like, oh wow. It's just like the sense of space, the cleanliness, the resolution, the detail was coming out more and more, and I was just like, after that stunned moment there, I was like, well, shoot, now I gotta spend money on cables too. And it's like, I didn't want that to be the case, right? I didn't want to hear differences in cables, but it was there. I couldn't ignore it, and all that. And so it was just, I mean, I'm working on a series trying to explain why it is that cables, at least in the analog domain, can make audible differences. And it's taking me a long time to get to it because, I mean, as you guys are alluding to here, you got to be very careful how you state this stuff. And I also just have a ton of gear and, a real job to get to as well. But that was one of the surprises, is that, yes, cables can in fact matter, and it's not always just because some of them are made poorly and give them a bad name. It's just because conductive properties really do change with conductive materials, with the geometry of the cable, with the dielectrics. Like, physicists, scientists, engineers have known for nearly a century that all of those things affect signal transmission. And yet a lot of us are pretending like that's not real. And I guess I don't really understand that, but that is the reality we're in at the moment.
Have you seen Brian? I can't think of his name now. He's the designer for Iconoclast cables. There's a really long interview with him on YouTube. And he's talking about the process they went through in designing the Iconoclast cables. And it's brilliant because he's not trying to justify anything. He's just talking about, here's all the things that matter, here's all the things we thought about. And one of the things that really stood out to me was that they know scientifically all of the different elements that are going to affect how a cable performs. They know exactly how they interact, but it's so complicated that they can't predict what the end result's going to be in terms of sonically. And so he's basically talking about the fact that, and I'm probably paraphrasing it badly here, but the gist of it is that he talks about all the things they had to consider in terms of the geometry, the thickness of each individual strand, the materials being used, etc., etc. But they couldn't just punch it all into a computer and get it to calculate which was going to be the optimal, because they just can't yet manage all of those different variables and understand which one's going to actually sound the best. So it was a process of that, a bit like what Rob Watts has done with some of his designs, where it's that thing of, I think this is theoretically going to make a difference, I'll make the changes and I'll plug it in and I'll have a listen. And it's that ongoing kind of iterative process of change something, listen, change something, listen. But it's a really cool video just purely because it explains every scientific principle that they know influences the sound of a cable. But the challenge is, as we just said, they don't know necessarily what combination of them sounds best.
Yeah, I don't know that I've seen that, but if you share the link with me, I will put it in the description of this video.
Yeah, I'll find it for you.
After the fact, that would be cool. And like, I want to come back to, for a moment, like, because we've said it here in this live stream as well, that, we do all of these things and then we change this, we go from the, from like hardwired LAN to the Optibox and all of that, and it makes these very small changes. We don't really know why and all of that. It is very complicated, but I will also submit that with AC signals, which our audio signals are, they travel down conductors, at speeds that vary with frequency. And that's really important because, like, if you were to pluck a guitar string or hit a piano key or something like that on a real world instrument, you get a bunch of waves coming from that string all happening at the same time. You get the fundamental frequency, you get the harmonics, you get the overtones, and all of that all stacked up on each other and all being at different frequencies. So when you start messing with the time alignment of those frequencies as they travel down a wire, you're going to start changing the nature of the sound that's received on the other end. Right, and particularly as you get higher and higher up in frequency, even in the audible spectrum, a tiny little shift ends up being a larger proportion of the wavelength, and that just starts messing with the alignments on things. And so we say, well, it doesn't change much. I don't know if that's true or not. Like, what does changing much mean? I think, like, you know, if we are going to say, oh, go ahead.
Well, the thing with that is, I mean, that's phase response, basically, is whether the two frequencies are what they are in terms of relative phase. The thing is, with all this stuff, it's, I mean, I'm personally kind of in the middle, so to speak, on cables generally, but it depends on what we're talking about. Because if people say cables make no difference, there is no reason to, you know, do anything other than just buy a cable and be done with it, that's wrong, because there are absolutely situations where cables make a difference. And both in terms of edge cases, like if you use a passive preamp or if you use ribbon drivers or something, the cable absolutely makes a difference. It's not a mystery. It's predictable. It's measurable. It's demonstrable. It's just how it is. But then there's a lot of situations like headphone cables or interconnects and stuff where the properties of the cable absolutely can change things, but the debate is about the fact that other than situations where the cable is either outright broken or just has properties so far outside the normal that, yes, it does change things, but that's why. Generally speaking, there aren't really any instances where the cables have properties which would shift things like the phase response to a degree that is likely to be audible. And obviously, there's, you know, it's never an absolute foregone conclusion as to what is and isn't audible, but you know, when you're talking about the speed of light down a cable.
I mean, and I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes in too, is that it's not actually established anywhere that I know of, like, what is the threshold at which a pattern of sound has to change for it to be detectable.
Phase response generally has been shown to be, other than in certain characteristics where the behavior is very non-linear, speaker crossovers, that's quite a good example. But for what's called linear time invariant systems, headphones count as that. Overall phase response has been shown generally to be very, like, it's a very high threshold, as in it has to be a very drastic change in order for it to be perceived. So I'm personally extremely skeptical about that in terms of cables and stuff. I've heard differences with cables, but then afterwards when I was like, okay, why does this sound different? Like there was one, it was the harmonic dyne Helios. I used the stock cable and then I swapped to another one just because the other one was softer and more comfy. And I was like, these sound different. Why do they sound different? And then I tested it with an LTR meter and the capacitance on the stock cable was insane. I don't even know how they made a cable with that high capacitance. But that's why it was. So, I mean, I got fancy cables. Like this cable is not cheap. Personally, I buy them for aesthetics and comfort, though. So I'm in the middle in terms of, like, when people say, oh, you know, digital's digital, it's just bits. The cables make no difference. No, they do. You can show that. I can demonstrate that very easily that they do make a difference. Whether it's audible or not, I am much more skeptical there generally.
I think it's well, I suppose it comes back to, like, you know, my experience with different DACs and having the Neo Stream affect that, and also, like, you know, like WaveTheory. Well, Brian, you were saying in one of the previous videos about how different people have different thresholds of what they can perceive. So, you know, I was brought up around, you know, piano, and if you're brought up around music and you're hearing a lot of music, then maybe you're more sensitive to subtle differences where other people may. I think you mentioned a book which talked about that, where people who are maybe less, you know, not brought up around music may not be so sensitive to the subtleties and differences in things. So it depends on one's own personal thresholds as well. I'm extremely sensitive to sound in general, and differences. So I'll notice maybe smaller things, even though it's like, am I really hearing something? I'm not quite sure always. So I think that comes down to these things not being straightforward. This is true and that is not. But there being different, being the situation in which something has an effect, and that stuff that we're exploring. And I think I think all of us are in the middle in that I think I like to approach things like, okay, I'm going to assume that this thing I'm going to add change or in my system is not going to have any effect, and I prefer to be surprised by any change that happens, rather than thinking, just like people obviously buy things hoping that they'll give us, someone was saying that they have an old streamer and an old DAC streamer, and they were wondering, is the latest tech, is the headphone amp out of date and all that kind of thing, and should they upgrade, and upgrading for the sake of wanting to feel like they've got the latest technology. So I think I think the complexity of it is what's really fascinating on the one hand and really irritating on the other, because you can't say definitively, this is this is going to do this or that's going to do that, when it just does. It depends on the setup you have, and you have to go by component by component.
Right. I'm gonna there was a comment in there that Cameron, if you have those studies that you just referenced on,
I was just going to respond to that.
phase
I'll send them to you so that we can put them in the video description afterwards.
Yeah,
and just on that point, I mean, this is one thing which kind of also spices up the debate sometimes, where there are absolutely studies, including peer-reviewed ones and stuff, where you if you actually read through it and you look at the methodology, you go, this isn't actually conclusive at all. It's like it's a good test, but it's not conclusive. It doesn't actually say, okay, well, this is now the truth. That's not what it's doing. And it's healthy to kind of be skeptical of, or try and poke holes in the methodology for studies and stuff. And yeah, so I'll send those ones. There were a couple where it is a little bit flaky, but there are some where it's very solid. But also there's a couple things which are also just mechanical truth. It's not a study thing. The phase response and the frequency response are inherently linked. Like when people look at the group delay and frequency, or the phase response of a headphone versus the frequency response, actually it's the same information, and you can correct phase and frequency response at the same thing. And if there is a phase change due to the cable, there will be a treble roll-off which reflects that, and you can correct it with EQ, and that puts it back together. Additionally, there are also things like, and I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, so I'm not going to say exact numbers, but it's something like half a degree of temperature change. If you're listening, this was speakers, not headphones, but half a degree of temperature change in the room, if you're sat just a couple meters away, has so much more of an impact than even quite a significant property shift in the cables. So there's things like that where it's like, even if it necessarily is the case, people kind of forget about other stuff which actually does make more of a difference. Like, no one talks about regulating the temperature in the listening room. But there's a lot of people who talk about cables. So there's things like that which are kind of interesting.
Is that why music sounds better at night? Because it gets cooler at night and everything sounds better?
I imagine that's more of a physiological thing. Because that actually absolutely happens. But I imagine that's more of just a... Because, there's times where you'll listen to a system or your system and you go, it's fatiguing and harsh or whatever. Or it's like soft and... Like, your perception of it changes depending on your mood. Are you hungry? Are you tired? What time of day is it? That kind of thing. We change a lot, which is also why... longer term audible memory is like just absolutely terrible generally, because you're not comparing things in the same way.
I thought the nighttime thing was to do with less electronics being used, so less noise in the system theoretically. So I guess let's guess that was the reason. But actually, speaking of, okay, here's another one that can trigger people and they can get angry at us. So I have
yeah.
That's the fun
Pull
part.
them out there.
Yeah, so I have the new N7 in for review, which is a 1-bit player, right? A 1-bit DAP. And that's a whole thing in itself, obviously. But so good old Andy goes, you got to run it in for at least 50 hours, maybe even 100, so before it changes. So I've been literally having it sitting here in this clamp on my desk and running through headphones and stuff like that overnight mostly, or during the day sometimes. And so I listening to it and okay, and I made some notes about how it sounded, and then 25, 30 hours later of running, it sounds sibilant and harsh, and my system doesn't sound sibilant and harsh. It's like, okay, now I've had years ago this happened where we recorded over so many hours. This particular was a total $99 item, 15, not 15 years ago, almost 15 years ago. So this is going, a piece of rubbish basically. And we recorded at what hour how this particular thing sounded. Oh no, was it the $99 thing? Maybe it was a different product. But we have recorded like how we perceived the sound at certain hour points in using it. And it turned out the people's impressions matched. Like the circuit seemed to change. I think it was due to heat because I just left mine switched on without playing music, and the heat it got quite warm, and I reckon the heat was affecting it. This gets very warm. This is hand warmer territory because it's upsampling everything to 512 DSD before outputting it, and halfway through its run in, everything sounds sibilant and harsh, and then another couple of days later, it sounds fine again. And I'm like, okay, that hasn't happened to me for like almost 10, 11, 12 years. And that's just a surprise. And I could be put down to time of the day or other things, but I was listening to other gear at the time, so I don't think it was. So really bizarre surprises, but this has an all discrete circuit, all discrete components, and a resistor array for the DSD output switch, and resistors can measurably, with heat, with the temperature, can measurably change their resistance enough to affect an audio circuit. And there's a atomic bulb measured it, and you do the calculations, and yes, it can actually shift sound enough to be audible. So that was a really interesting one. And then people
Atomic
get
Bob's
angry at
got
me
some
that
good posts. He's got
yeah.
some nice stuff.
But it's nice that we can actually have like Cameron, you have an APX 555, and which is great because now we can actually, and people like Resolve, and we have access to other people who we can talk about. Okay, we have. Well, I want to just add how science works, which is not a delimiter of truth, but actually we have a theory or conjecture about what's something we experience and what's going on, and we try and find out some connection to what is actually going on and what's causing our experiences, and that's actually scientific progress in a sense. So
and it's always evolving. I think that's the key that I think sometimes gets missed. Like what's truth right now according to the science can then evolve over time. Like we were talking before about what we can and can't hear, and there's studies at the moment about the fact that having high frequency content in music that we can't actually audibly or consciously perceive, they've got studies showing that it does somehow influence our perception of the music. So we can't, if you were just to isolate those signals and play them, people would go, there's nothing playing. But if you include that content, so they were using, I can't think of the instrument being used, but they were using an instrument that has a lot of high frequency content. And when they kept that content in across multiple different studies, they were looking at different things, but sometimes having that content kept in allowed people to comfortably listen louder before they said it was getting too loud. There was another one that it was just purely about the perceptual enjoyment of the music, and it was improved when that was left in. And again, we're talking decent sized studies from memory. And so I guess to your point, Amos, it's that evolution where once upon a time we would have said that stuff's inaudible, doesn't matter. Now they're saying, well, it's not audible, that's true, so the truth remains as it was, but somehow it's doing something. We are somehow perceiving the effects of it, even if we can't perceive the sound itself. And that's
Right.
that ongoing evolution.
This is kind of what I was referring to earlier too, is that any and all wave information that is carried through these electrical circuits that are our audio systems, they interfere with each other, right? So even if a wave is happening way up in the supersonic region where we don't hear that information itself, the way it's affecting what's in the audible range, we probably can hear. Right, and so isolating all of that out and all that, it is complex. And then it's also, I mean, we've got engineers in the field to say, or scientists and engineers in the field that say, hey, we can predict all of this stuff about a cable or a new circuit design, and then we plug it in and it sounds like crap, right? Like it's a very complex thing. And I will add that the other thing that we have to measure that we don't really have sufficient measurements for yet is, again, what's going on up here between our ears, right? Like it would be great if somehow we could put headphones on someone's head and then stick them in an MRI machine, like, or an fMRI, kind of thing, and have them listen to music and just see how the brain lights up, and then swap out different stuff in the signal chain and watch that happen again, right? Is it different? Like, does the brain respond differently because of the different gear and all of that? Like, that would be really cool, but to my knowledge, no one has done that yet.
Not in the audio gear space. So the book that we were talking about before of the Sound Mind, I think it is. We talked about that in the very first episode that we did together. That one, they were talking about some of the studies they've done where they're literally actually mapping the brain and seeing how the brain is responding and which parts of the brain are involved in different sounds, different responses. So looking at the timing elements of audio, the pitch elements of audio, they're mostly looking at speech. But that's been done in that level. I just don't know if anyone's gone as far as audio. And I don't know if we've had this conversation on here or if it's just come up on my channel and probably your channel separately too. There's not really a body of interest in an academic sense to study this stuff that we're talking about. The companies don't want to pour lots and lots of money into it because there's no need. They're selling their gear anyway. And so there's a bit of a hole there where there's no funding to do that sort of research, but I agree with you, Brian, it'd be fascinating to do it.
Yeah. I mean, and unfortunately, you can't stick a copper conductor into an MRI machine. That would be a really bad idea.
That's a good point too. Yeah.
So I want to make sure that gets stated before someone out there tries it. But
sneak it into the laboratory.
Yeah. But like, it would be really fascinating if we had a way to, like measure what's going on in the brain when we swap out different audio components too. Because
I reckon.
I mean, I am a scientist, and I do think that like all of this is physical or physiological, which is just another way of saying physical in the body. Okay, response ultimately that can ultimately be measured. There are just things that we haven't fully figured out how to measure yet, or have we figured out how the measurements map to our experiences? Like, we're just not there
I reckon
yet.
it will come down to a combination. You know, I have an Apple Watch, you know, which measures some stuff in my body. And I reckon that if you combine quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and, you know, body sensors, I reckon in 50 years we'll have devices on our body that tell us all what's going on and how we're feeling, and we'll use artificial intelligence to create things to make us feel good, like even whole movies and stuff like that. And I reckon that's where it will go when the technology, the combination of, you know, increased computing power from quantum computing combines with artificial intelligence and, you know, body sensors, and that, I think that's when that will be taken seriously.
We've got those now, Amos. Those vests you put on, the Rumble vests. It's done. It's
it has. I have them. I have it.
I did a review on one of those.
I was going to say you did that, didn't you, Cameron?
It was like it's fine for VR stuff. It's kind of fun, but the thing is, they advertise. I was interested in it because they advertised it as a music accessory, and it just didn't really work for that for all sorts of reasons. They got really annoyed with me as well. They were like, "You need to take the video down." Like,
oh,
why?
really?
I was like, well, because it's a negative, you know, it's just dissuading people from buying the product. I'm like, okay, I mean, that's kind of the point of a negative review. Like, I don't think people should buy it. It's like, yeah, but we have a free trial system. It's like, okay, but I could still talk about it. Like, I'm not, if you want, you know, I'm happy to talk with you guys about what can be improved instead of, you know, I know you're working on a V2.0, so, you know, maybe I can give my input there or something. But I'm not just going to take down a video because you don't like it. That's kind of the point.
Hey, I know we've gone long, but I'm really interested to know, maybe we save this for next month or whenever we come back together. How many of you had pressure, whether it's to take it down or just a distributor, retailer, whoever getting cranky with you? And I'm not asking for anyone to name names, but have many of you had kind of negative impacts to you / the channel because you've said negative things about a product?
I think the main one is companies will just not talk to you afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was at, actually, no, I probably shouldn't say that one. But yeah, like the main.
Oh, you have to now. We're coming after you, Cameron.
No, because
you tell us. No,
no, I mean that's the main thing. Like, there's a lot of companies where they, I think, behave in a way which is really good. You know, if you give them negative feedback in a review or just ahead of time. Like, you know, I've had a few things where companies have sent me stuff either before it's released and they didn't want a review, they just wanted feedback on it. And even if it was really negative in a couple of instances, they're like, thank you, this is great, we'll work on that. Then there's other companies who kind of like, you know, you say something, not even if you're negative, but not if you're like, this is the best thing since sliced bread. If you don't say that, they just
It's not an
will not
ad.
talk to you again. Some of them to the extent that I'm like, do you want this back? And they just won't even like give me a shipping label or something.
Yep,
So,
I've had that too.
yeah.
I've had a couple like you said where I've said to them, very rarely I'll email them and say, hey, I'm not going to say good things about this. Do you want me to proceed with the review? I don't normally do that because it's normally a case where I think it's important to share the good, the bad, and the ugly on the channel. But very occasionally, for whatever the nuanced reasons are at the time, I'll say, this isn't going to get a good review. Do you want me to proceed? And normally they've been really good with that. There was a review I did put out, though, that was not particularly positive, and I don't think I'm ever going to get gear from that particular place again. I wasn't out to bash it, and I've actually said good things about other products of theirs, but I think it sort of damaged the working relationship there. But I think it's important that we speak the truth rather than try to protect the sources of gear as time goes on.
Honestly, I mean, people kind of imply that, you know, reviewers will try and keep manufacturers or distributors happy and stuff. Honestly, it's usually not necessarily the audience, but the audio community that actually is the more difficult beast to work with. Because like, there's a lot of products, particularly if they're more expensive ones, people are a little bit more sort of invested with them. And, you know, you'll say something negative and people would sometimes get really quite hostile about it. Even if it's like, I mean, there's been products where even regardless of what I thought about it subjectively, where I pointed out like an actual just straight up flaw, like you can't really argue that this should happen, and people get like annoyed. It's like, well, you know, that doesn't matter because it still sounds. Or why are you talking about that? It's like, because it's a problem. Why? Yeah,
I got a lot of
the
flack for
audience
that.
can be trickier.
I got a lot of flack for the A90D review, which probably has a couple of errors, but essentially everyone considers it a negative review. And it's like at the end I thought it was a decent amp. I was just critical of the fact that they hyped it up over, you know, measurement numbers. And so, well, you know, you did that, so that's where that's going to affect the review. But generally I just talked about my experiences with the amp for the most part. And I got heaps of abuse, flat out abuse for it, which I had to, you know, go through and put the whole thing on moderation. But I think speaking of that, the only one now I can talk about it because the owner of the company has passed away. So I didn't know it was actually a year ago. Audio Valve sent me that huge. Well, you see, I ages ago there was the Audio Valve RKV. It's called an Audio Valve RKV, and back in the 2000s, late to mid 2000s, it was a huge OTL tube amp with you had a separate box you could actually use to power low powered speakers and other stuff, or have an impedance box which had a switch. You could actually switch the output impedance. And I was curious about this thing, and despite the thing being loaded with brass, which made its shipping costs horrendous, I actually ended up buying one because I heard it was a legendary amp. It was actually pretty okay. I was really good HD 800 amp, but it was actually very sensitive to power. It was sensitive to power cables. I said that, but it was that had one of those kinds of power supplies. But so I sold it off to someone who really wanted one, and then Helmut Becker, who owned the company, said, "Oh, I saw you used to own one. Do you want to review the Was it the big one, the Solaris?" Yeah, and so he sent one over, and he said, you know, you can ship it back later or whatever. And of course he ended up letting me keep it, but I didn't want to keep it because it was huge, and I just gave it a straight up review. I said, you know, it's a pretty good amp, but it has these problems in that it had its maximum output power at 120 ohms, which is ridiculous, which is kind of not good. It actually would clip with Susvaras if you turn the volume up, and you know, the electrostatic output was kind of basic transformer based, like a Woo or a Wii, and you know, it was like a good all round amp if you want a good all round amp, but it was kind of the value at $6,000 or €6,000, I forget which. Was kind of difficult considering all the gear you can get. Now, that's what I said. It's good, but you know, the value proposition was not so good. And I didn't hear anything back from him. But apparently, through this other, I happen to know one of the distributors in another country, and the guy said, "Oh, Helmut was very pissed off with you, really angry, and everything like that." And he still used my picture of the Susvaras sitting on top of the Solaris for his promo, the promo page for it for since then. But, you know, I had said that it clips with Susvaras, and so he apparently made changes to the design and stuff like that. But he was basically rehashed the same design in all his gear. That was the only one where he got really, really pissed off. I think he was expecting me to orgasm over it and all that. It's like, everyone would ask, you know.
How do we always end up on this?
Amos takes us down this road every time.
Always, sorry, just before the end it starts.
It's always Amos. Yeah.
There's a
so
theme here.
I will answer Lachlan's question here really quickly because we do need to wrap this up here.
Yeah.
Like, I might be in the middle of one of those situations right now. I'm not going to say with who, that would be inappropriate, but I'm thinking that I've upset someone and they're not going to talk to me much, and we'll see how that plays out. I want to end this on a positive note, though, that like someone who does this well. I did a re-review of the Odyssey Carbon a couple of months ago now, and Odyssey's sound has always been hit and miss for me. Like their tunings just don't always work well for my ears and that sort of thing. And the Carbon was one of those that was just a bit of a miss for me. And I like part of the deal from getting that piece from Odyssey was that I would send them the review first for a tech screening and that sort of thing. And I got an email from the rep there that just says, "Hey, my boss wants to talk to you," which is always scary, right? But it was Mark Cohen. And he and I actually had a very nice phone call that ended up being just two audio nerds talking about audio, right? It was great ultimately, and he just did a really good job. He says your review looks great, and he just tried to offer some clarity and some elaboration on some of the points that I made up, and then he did not make a single demand that I change anything or even add what he was telling me. I thought some of the things that he told me were really interesting and the audience would appreciate it, so I made the decision on my own to go back and edit some of that stuff in. But just an example of it done well was I was critical of that piece. I didn't like it all that much, but Odyssey just took it right in stride and didn't say anything, didn't complain, didn't do anything like that. They just said, okay, what you publish is what you publish.
Mark's fantastic.
Here's some extra info. It was great. Yeah.
It's always important to try and like speak to the manufacturer or whoever it is first. I think because even with my MQA video, I contacted MQA ahead of time. I'm like, look, this is what I've got. This is what I'm planning to write. Do you have any? Is there anything here that you think is just incorrect? And you might not always get a response that I think is actually genuine. Sometimes they'll try and squirm their way out of something which is an actual problem, but sometimes it'll be like, oh no, that shouldn't be happening, try this or try doing this, or oh okay, maybe that unit's bad, we'll send you another one, and it sorted it. It's not worth just a negative review when actually it's not the product that's at fault. But it's also really just great when manufacturers are the other way around, like Ferrum Hem, they sent me an ore before it was released to do some sort of testing stuff on it, and I found a couple issues with it, and I let them know, and they're like, oh crap, okay, when they froze production immediately, fixed it, and then started everything up again. And so it's great when companies are that communicative and that sort of not necessarily just like responsive to, but in some cases looking for constructive criticism. They want that, and that's always really good. I mean, if I had any sort of advice for audio companies, be it manufacturers or distributors or whoever, you can't, if there is a genuine issue, you can't really get out of it with just marketing waffle. It's just not going to work. I think people generally are a lot smarter than that. And from a business standpoint, sometimes the best thing is just to ignore it. If I was running a business, that's sometimes what you probably would want to do. But generally speaking, the best thing to do is be proactive about it. Say, okay, this is a problem. We weren't aware of it. We're sorry that this has happened. Here's what we're going to do to fix it, and here's how you can address it at home or whatever. That's the best way to handle things.
Most manufacturers that I've talked to, the people they're enthusiasts. They really want to make a good product. I think I remember there was Crinical's video.
Most companies want to make good stuff. They're not just trying to pull the wool over people's eyes.
I remember Critical said, why aren't star reviews, always somewhere around the middle? Why are they always mostly 4 and 5 stars? But it's actually most gear out there is actually, there's other reasons for that. I want to make a video about it. But I think most manufacturers do want to make a good product. They want it to be successful. They want the people who will enjoy it to buy it. And actually, I've said in my FAQ, the people who won't enjoy it, they don't want them to buy it. Because like Mike, Jason from Shit Audio is very straightforward about this. They want the people who will get satisfaction to buy it, and people who are not interested in the certain limitations they have to not buy the product, and that's how it should work. But
you can't make a one-size-fits-all product. happens.
No.
Yeah.
Just doesn't
If
work.
you have a very strong sense of pride in your manufacturing a product, that could get in the way of, making a good product. If you're accepting criticism and stuff like that. But the ones who engage, people like engage us, engage the community, really end up being successful and accept the criticism and say, okay, this is how it is for these reasons, and usually people are accepting of that if you communicate with them.
Yeah, I mean, there's very little crap on the market. You get the occasional dud, but there's very little stuff that is outright bad. There are things that are better for one person and not so good for somebody else. But yeah, I can't think of many products. I think I'd have to go all the way back to something like the Blonde B30 or whatever it was. That horrendous headphone that I think it's the only time I've done like a full-on clickbait title like warning, 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 because it was just so bad. But that's probably about as far back as I have to go to find it, and that's going back years now.
That
there's
kind of
very little
starts a
crap.
lot of the arguments as well. Is people going like, but this thing sounds good, so you must be wrong. Like, I didn't say it sounded bad. You said maybe I preferred this thing or whatever. Because as you say,
That's it.
most stuff nowadays is very good. There is not that much genuinely bad stuff.
Yep.
And sorry, I know we're kind of tangenting. And
Yeah, I
stuff, but
say
one thing I'd
we need
is,
to wrap this up,
we
gentlemen.
do.
Just one more thing
Yeah.
is, I'm really glad that companies seem to be doing a lot more actual sort of sourcing community feedback. There was, and I can't remember who it was, unfortunately, but there was an IEM manufacturer at CanJam in New York, who they had just 2 units. One was red, one was blue, and they just asked people to try them and say which one do you prefer and why.
Oh,
And they were just
cool.
collecting data on that. That was really cool to see. And it's like Sennheiser. They recently put out on HeadFi just a big questionnaire asking what people sort of would improve on over the HD800S, and then said, no, we're not planning on making a new HD800, but all the questions are about what you would change about that. So I don't know, it's hard to say about that, but yeah, it's cool to see, and I hope that that's a trend that continues. Is don't just kind of necessarily do stuff internally and then throw it out into the world and then be surprised when the community feedback isn't that great. Try and get early community feedback. Take it to CanJam, get surveys, all that kind of stuff.
Or bring it to Australia. We'll happily welcome it.
that.
North America gets everything. Bring it down here.
Or
There needs to be
Japan.
a CanJam
Or Japan,
down under.
absolutely.
All
I'm
right.
surprised there isn't a CanJam in Australia.
We need one.
Yeah. So that should probably be it, huh? Thanks everyone for watching. Make sure that you subscribe to all of our channels. I've put links down in the description below if you haven't subbed yet. And then, yeah, leave a comment after the fact. We love to come back and read the comments after the stream too. But all right, I think that's it.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Until next time.
Thank you very much.
All right. We'll see you, everyone.
And we're off the